What's one small thing someone did in your family that left a big scar?
At the family barbecue, the kind where the folding tables wobble on dry grass and kids scream over the crackle of cornhole bean bags landing short, my cousin Jacob laughed so hard he started coughing on a rib bone when I told him I handled logistics. My Uncle Randy, 3 beers deep and already leaning into that loud, back-slapping swagger he always wore after 4th of July, narrowed his eyes at me like I'd said something out of a sitcom and asked if that meant I was driving one of those blue Amazon vans that peel out at every stop sign. The worst part wasn't the question, it was the way the rest of them waited, half grinning, half choking back their own jabs, like I was an open invitation for mockery. And when I shrugged and said, something like that, someone muttered just loud enough for me to hear, or she takes out the trash. I smiled. Not the tight, passive-aggressive kind of smile that begs to be noticed, but the kind that's grown from years of understanding that arguing only makes it worse. Then I got up from the rickety lawn chair, picked up the actual trash bag sagging with soggy plates and half-eaten burgers, and walked it over to the green bin by the garage, my footsteps muffled by the lawn, my pride intact but heavy, like carrying something breakable that no one else knew existed. No one said thank you. No one offered to help. And that somehow was the most predictable part of the day. The thing is, I could have shut them up in 10 seconds flat. I could have cleared my throat, leaned against the picnic table with the ants crawling up its legs, and casually dropped numbers that would have made their beer guts suck in from sheer surprise. But I didn't. Because they didn't deserve that kind of satisfaction, and because some truths don't set anyone free, they just complicate the hell out of everything. Later that evening, after the sun had gone down and the citronella candles were doing a poor job of chasing off the mosquitoes, I was standing by the sink, washing dishes like I always did while the others gathered around the fire pit outside, retelling stories that were barely funny the first time. I just scrubbed the last bit of potato salad off a plastic fork when my phone buzzed on the counter next to me. One text. It was from my sister Emily. She wrote, "You didn't tell them, did you? Mom can't stop crying." I stared at those words for a long time, dish towel in hand, fingers suddenly numb, because I knew exactly what she meant. And the truth of it hit me somewhere deep in the gut, like when you suddenly remember a moment you tried to bury so far down you hoped it wouldn't find its way back. Now, here's something you should know. I didn't always handle logistics. That's just the name I gave it. It was easier than the truth, which didn't fit neatly into a job title or make for casual barbecue conversation. My family thought I was a quiet type, the dependable one, the girl who never made a scene and always brought store-bought pie like it was her entire personality. But what they never saw, what they never even thought to ask, was that the life I led from Monday to Friday, and often well into Saturday nights, was nothing like the cardboard version of me they'd constructed in their heads. I wasn't the family screw-up or the loud drama queen. That was Emily's domain, at least until a few years ago when she got married and pretended to find religion. I wasn't the golden child either. That title belonged to Jacob, who somehow made failing upward into a full-time sport. I was just me, the middle child. The one who everyone assumed would quietly coast through life doing safe things. But the only thing safe about my life was the distance I kept from them. Emily's message wasn't asking out of curiosity. It was asking out of fear. She knew what I'd done, or at least part of it, and she knew that if the truth ever slipped out at a backyard barbecue over ribs and Bud Light, it wouldn't just change how they saw me, it would ruin everything they believed about themselves, too. Because, you see, they didn't just mock me out of ignorance. They mocked me because it made them feel better about their own choices. Their mortgages, their 9-to-5s, their PTO meetings and long-hair pride, none of that could compete with the discomfort of knowing that someone they thought they understood had quietly outgrown all of it. Or, worse, had done something they wouldn't dare try themselves. So I dried my hands, locked my phone, and walked back outside. I sat by the fire pit, smiled when someone offered me a warm beer, and nodded along as Jacob told some story about getting kicked out of a casino for card counting, which I knew was a lie, because he could barely count tips at Applebee's. No one mentioned the job again. No one asked why I'd left early last Christmas. No one remembered that 2 years ago I disappeared for almost 6 months and didn't return a single call. And I didn't bring it up, Because that's the thing about family. They'd rather pretend not to know than face the version of you that doesn't need their approval anymore. You ever have one of those moments where you realize everyone around you has already decided who you are, and they're not interested in being wrong? That was me, staring into the fire, thinking how easy it would be to feed them the truth like kindling. Let it burn through their assumptions, their jokes, their smug little grins. But I didn't. Because I had something better than that. I had time. And time, as I've learned, is the most dangerous weapon of all. Because while they were busy laughing at my job title, I'd already changed their lives in ways they hadn't even noticed yet. And when they finally did, it would be too late to laugh. When Emily's message popped up on my screen that night, the porch still smelled faintly of lighter fluid and burnt sausages, and my legs were sore from standing too long in the kitchen, scrubbing dishes no one thanked me for. While outside, the same stories got passed around like they were heirlooms instead of tired fabrications. The glow of my phone was cold against my eyes, and the words she'd sent, "You didn't tell them, did you? Mom can't stop crying," sat there like a punch that didn't hurt until a few seconds later, once the brain had caught up to the body. I stood there in the dark hallway just off the back door, one barefoot on tile and the other on the rough welcome mat, as the night pressed in from all sides, and the silence in my chest grew heavier than the words themselves. I didn't answer her right away, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wasn't sure whether I was supposed to feel guilt or satisfaction, or maybe something darker that I didn't want to name yet. I leaned against the doorframe and listened to the muffled laughter of the family outside, my family, in name at least, still going on like nothing had cracked, still roasting each other over dumb things like football stats and how many times Uncle Randy had been divorced. Still too wrapped up in themselves to notice the slow fault lines spreading beneath their feet. It was almost funny, in a bitter sort of way, how people could live their entire lives convinced they understood someone, when all they really knew was the version that person had allowed them to see. Emily knew. Not everything, not the full story, but enough to panic the second she saw my face tighten when the jokes started earlier in the evening. She'd been watching me more closely than the others, her wine glass held a little too tight, the corners of her mouth twitching like she was waiting for me to crack, to snap and say something that would finally blow the thin veil off what they thought they knew. And when I didn't, when I just smiled, took out the trash, and let them laugh, she must have felt the shift in the air, like a storm that hasn't broken, but makes the hairs on your arms stand up anyway. The thing with Emily is, she's always been the one who needed control. Even when we were kids, she had this way of trying to manage chaos by pretending it wasn't there, as if denial were just another form of order. But me? I've learned to live with chaos. I've even learned how to use it. That's the part that scares her. She knows that I'm not looking for acceptance or pity or some clean family reconciliation arc like the ones she watches in Hallmark movies when her husband is out late again. She knows I'm past all that. And what really terrifies her is that I've learned to stay quiet, not because I'm afraid, but because I know exactly what kind of noise the truth makes when it finally arrives. So when she sent that message, I didn't rush to reply. I just walked back into the guest room I'd been given, complete with a floral comforter that smelled like dryer sheets and disapproval, and sat down on the edge of the bed, letting the old wooden frame creak under the weight of everything I wasn't saying. My suitcase sat in the corner, mostly untouched, because I hadn't really planned to stay long. This whole barbecue thing had been a formality, a guilt trip masquerading as a reunion, and I'd only agreed to come because Mom had cried on the phone about how everyone just wants to see you again, sweetheart. Like I'd disappeared to punish them instead of to protect myself. When I finally texted Emily back, I kept it simple. I wrote, "No. I didn't tell them. But maybe you should." There was no reply for almost an hour, and during that hour I sat perfectly still, phone in my lap, eyes on the ceiling, replaying the evening like a crime scene, Jacob's laughter, Randy's jab, the passive-aggressive side-eye from Aunt Carla when I said I was too full for pie, the pitying glance from my cousin's wife, whose idea of rebellion is getting her nails painted black instead of coral. All of them, sitting around like they were starring in some wholesome American family commercial, while I held back a truth that could have split the whole damn table down the middle. Eventually, Emily wrote back. This time, no question marks. Just a sentence that made my chest tighten in a way I didn't expect. She was looking through Dad's papers again. That's how it started. I read it 3 times, maybe 4, because that sentence wasn't about curiosity. It was about consequence. It meant Mom had found something, or worse, had remembered something, and now the foundation she'd built her understanding of me upon was starting to shift. The thing with memory is that it doesn't always work in linear time. It surfaces what it wants, when it wants, like a tape that skips to the worst part with no warning. And if she was back in those papers, then maybe she'd found what I'd hidden, or maybe she'd just seen enough to suspect that I wasn't the daughter she'd made herself believe I was. And maybe, just maybe, she was crying not because she felt betrayed, but because she finally understood that I had been lying to protect her. Or maybe she was crying because she realized I'd become something she couldn't recognize, couldn't understand, and worst of all, couldn't control. By the time I put the phone down, the fire outside had burned low, and the voices had started to fade, replaced by the clinking of beer bottles and the soft thud of chairs being folded. I didn't go back out there. I lay down on the bed fully dressed, shoes still on, eyes open, mind racing. I thought about the word logistics and how it had served me well for so long, how it had been just vague enough to deflect questions, just boring enough to invite no further interest. But now, after tonight, I knew that shield wouldn't hold much longer. They were going to start asking questions. Emily would crack under pressure. Mom would dig deeper. And eventually, someone would put the pieces together, not all at once, not in a neat montage, but in fragments, the way truth always comes, jagged and inconvenient. And when that happened, they'd realize that while they'd spent years laughing at me for being small, I'd been making moves behind the scenes that touched every one of them in ways they never saw coming. And none of them, not Emily, not Mom, not even smug-ass Jacob, was ready for the answer to the question they never thought to ask. What exactly does handling logistics really mean? It's a strange thing, really, the way people will talk about you like you're an open book when all they've ever skimmed is the table of contents, never once realizing there's an entire library behind your eyes, full of stories you've deliberately left untold. Not because you're ashamed of them, but because you know the people around you wouldn't be able to handle the weight of knowing you're not the simple version they've made comfortable for themselves. For years, I let them believe I worked in logistics, a word so dull, so perfectly beige in meaning, that no one ever stopped to ask what exactly it entailed. To them, it sounded like I maybe organized warehouse shipments or coordinated deliveries for a grocery chain or managed a small office where someone else signed the real checks. It was just enough to seem legitimate, just obscure enough to shut down further interest, and that vagueness, that blurry little job title, gave me the breathing room I needed to build a life that didn't require anyone's approval, but came with a cost I carried alone. The truth was, and still is, that my job paid well. Not just I can pay my bills and maybe take a vacation once a year, well, but I've got accounts in banks I don't even use unless something's gone wrong, well. But I never flaunted it, never pulled into the driveway in a car that cost more than their annual income, never wore anything flashier than a clean pair of jeans and a black button-down when I showed up for these forced family functions. I didn't do it out of modesty or guilt. I did it because money is the quickest way to make people suspicious, and once they're suspicious, they start asking the kind of questions you can't brush off with polite smiles and second servings of potato salad. Back when I started, when the job was still new and I didn't fully understand what it would cost me, I told myself it was temporary. A way to catch up. A way to build something. I'd been working at a freight logistics firm, yes, actual logistics back then, pushing papers and managing routes for a boss who smelled like stale coffee and wore his wedding ring on a chain around his neck, like he was holding onto a promise that had already left the building. I was good at what I did, fast, thorough, invisible, and someone noticed. Not a coworker. Not a manager. Someone outside the company, someone whose name I was never given, just a first meeting in a restaurant that didn't take walk-ins and a quiet offer written on a napkin, an operation looking for someone who could move things, not packages or pallets, but information, digital, financial, confidential, things that didn't need to be tracked by barcodes, but by silence and speed. It started small. A contract here, a data route there, nothing illegal at first glance, but too precise to be innocent. They paid me for discretion, not just results. I moved files from one encrypted system to another, arranged digital drop-offs, rerouted funds through a labyrinth of clean accounts that didn't trip any alarms. I never asked what the money was for, and they never asked how I did it. All they cared about was that I got it done, on time, clean, untraceable. The only rule was, never speak about it. Not even to family. Especially not to family. And that was easy. Because my family never asked. They were too busy assuming I was just getting by, the way they were. When I sent Mom a check that covered the last year of her mortgage, just to help her out, she thanked me like I was some miracle daughter, the good one who always stepped up. When Emily called in tears after her husband got laid off and asked if I could spot her the down payment for their second car, I wired the money the next day and never mentioned it again. They all took the help like it was my duty, like I'd just been saving pennies and skipping takeout to make their lives easier, and I let them believe it, because explaining the truth would have not only shattered their perception of me, it would have exposed the fact that the money they'd built their latest comforts on might not be as clean as they assumed. The irony, of course, was that they laughed at my so-called low-level job while using the spoils of it to hold their own lives together. My silent income had paid for Emily's Invisalign, Mom's new roof, and even that stupid hot tub Jacob had installed last spring because it increases property value. And through it all, I stayed quiet, stayed small, stayed exactly what they expected me to be, because the moment I stepped outside that image, even slightly, the entire structure would crack under the weight of what I'd built behind their backs. But something changed after that barbecue. Something small, barely noticeable, like a shift in air pressure before a storm. Mom's crying wasn't just from confusion or suspicion, it was grief, a delayed reaction to a truth she was finally starting to piece together. Truth not about what I do, but about who I've become. Because when you live long enough pretending to be someone else, there comes a moment when the real version of you starts leaking through, whether you want it to or not. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized this job, this life, this carefully constructed maze of plausible deniability, it had become more than work. It had become identity. I didn't wake up one day and decide to keep secrets. Secrets just became easier than explanations. I didn't set out to deceive my family. I just realized that their version of me was never built to handle the truth. And now, here I am, paycheck steady, life secure, every corner of my story sanded down to avoid suspicion, while the people I love most continue to believe that I'm the one who settled, who stayed small, who never took risks. They believe that because it's easier than facing what really happened, that the quiet one at the table, the one taking out the trash and smiling through the jokes, made choices they wouldn't dare make, and now, the cost of those choices is coming due, not just for me, but for all of us. Because if they ever figure out where the money really came from, if they trace it back, connect the dots, ask the right questions, then the laughter, the mockery, the false pity, all of it turns to something much colder, much sharper. And they won't be able to laugh it off. Not when they realize they've been living off the paycheck they never bothered to question. By the time the sun rose the next morning, casting long streaks of pale light across the worn-out deck furniture and empty beer bottles that still littered the backyard like remnants of some forgettable celebration, I could already sense a shift in the air. Not the weather, which was still stubbornly warm and thick with summer humidity, but something more subtle and far more ominous. The kind of shift that creeps in through the cracks of your assumptions and makes you realize that something is unraveling beneath the surface, whether you're ready for it or not. The house was quieter than usual for a family gathering, too quiet for a Saturday morning when the kids were normally bouncing off walls, and the coffee pot should have been gurgling in the background, but instead, it was just stillness and that eerie sort of silence that only ever shows up after something's broken that no one wants to admit is broken yet. I hadn't slept, not really, just laid there with my eyes open in the dark, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned slow and steady, like a clock marking the time left before everything I'd carefully kept hidden began slipping out of my control. Emily hadn't messaged again, which, knowing her, was worse than getting 5 more texts full of panicked questions and passive-aggressive guilt, because silence from Emily wasn't peace, it was pressure. It meant she was spiraling in her own way, probably pacing her bedroom in that overpriced robe her husband had bought her the year they pretended to fall back in love, muttering to herself about what I'd done, what I might still do, and more importantly, whether Mom had actually figured it out or was just stumbling through the shadows of a truth she didn't yet have the language to name. I didn't even need to ask what papers Mom had found. I knew. There had been a file, one I'd buried deep in a box marked Taxes 2018, and tucked into the back of her attic when I'd visited under the guise of helping her declutter. It had been a mistake, a miscalculation driven by urgency and exhaustion, one of those moments where you think you'll circle back and clean up later. But then time passes, and you tell yourself it'll never come up anyway because who really digs through old financials unless they're looking for ghosts? But Mom was different. She was sentimental in that quietly dangerous way that attaches meaning to everything: receipts, expired coupons, even the envelopes from holiday cards long discarded. And I should have known better than to assume something important wouldn't eventually catch her eye if it had my name on it. She found something, no doubt about that, and the fact that Emily said she couldn't stop crying told me it wasn't confusion she felt, it was betrayal. But the irony, the dark twist in all of it, was that the betrayal she imagined wasn't even the real one. Because what Mom was mourning wasn't the truth itself, it was the death of the illusion she'd spent her whole life protecting, the image of me as her good, reliable daughter, the one who always played it safe, who sacrificed for others, who never broke the rules or colored outside the lines. That version of me had been a comfort to her, a source of pride she could parade in front of neighbors and friends, a quiet contrast to Emily's loud mistakes and Jacob's arrogant failures. And now that comfort was gone, shredded by a few documents she wasn't meant to see, pieces of a reality she hadn't been prepared to face. I found her in the kitchen, still in her nightgown, hair pulled into a loose knot that made her look older than she was, a mug of untouched coffee sitting in front of her like she'd forgotten what it was for. She didn't hear me come in. She was staring out the window, not at anything in particular, just into the trees beyond the backyard, her shoulders slumped forward like she'd been holding up the weight of a secret all night and finally let it start to crush her. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say, knowing that any explanation I gave would only make things worse, because when someone's grief isn't about what's been lost, but about what's been revealed, there's no way to comfort them without asking them to accept a version of you they never wanted to imagine. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin, almost brittle, like it had been soaked in tears and wrung out to dry. She didn't turn to look at me. She just said, "I thought I knew you." And in that moment, I realized that nothing I said would change how she felt, not the truth, not a softened version of it, not even a lie. She wasn't asking for an explanation. She was mourning the daughter she thought I was. I walked to the other side of the kitchen, leaned against the counter, and waited, hoping she would say more, ask a real question, give me something to work with. But instead, she finally looked at me, really looked, not through me or past me, but directly into my face, and what I saw in her eyes wasn't anger, or fear, or even disappointment. It was something far more painful. It was distance. As if she'd already begun rewriting our story in her mind, repositioning me as a stranger who had somehow worn her daughter's face for years without her realizing it. She asked one question before she stood up and left the room. Was it worth it? 3 words. That's all. But it hit harder than any accusation, any slap, any shouted condemnation. Because in those 3 words, she was asking whether the life I'd chosen, the money, the secrecy, the independence, the power had been worth giving up her trust, worth building something she couldn't be part of, worth letting go of the little girl she used to rock to sleep during thunderstorms. And the truth? I didn't know how to answer. Because some days, it did feel worth it. On the days when the money moved cleanly, when the risk was low and the pay was high, when the quiet felt like control and not isolation. But other days like this one, it didn't. It felt like I'd built an empire of silence on a foundation of exile, like I'd traded one kind of cage for another. She left the kitchen without waiting for an answer. She didn't look back. I stood there for a long time after she was gone, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the ceiling fan upstairs, the emptiness of the house around me. And then, without really planning it, I pulled out my phone, opened the encrypted app one never mentioned to anyone, and sent a message to a contact saved only as M. It said, "We might have a problem." Because I could handle their judgment. I could handle their silence, their whispers, even their tears. But if Mom found one folder, there might be more. And if anyone else stumbled onto what I'd hidden, this wouldn't just be a personal reckoning. It would be collateral damage. And the worst part? I knew it was coming. By the time Sunday evening arrived, the air had that certain weight to it, the kind that doesn't just predict a storm but promises it, thick and electric, the sky so still and swollen with tension that even the birds went quiet. As if the world itself had sensed something was about to give way. The backyard was mostly cleaned up by then, the remnants of the family barbecue scrubbed out of sight, the chairs folded and stacked, the grill wiped down to hide the blackened evidence of yesterday's fire, but no one could scrub away the shift in atmosphere. That heaviness in every glance, every paused sentence, every moment that lingered just 1 second too long. You could almost hear the undercurrent humming beneath it all, a current of discomfort and suspicion and a deep, aching question that no one wanted to be the first to ask. What exactly did she do? I kept to myself most of the day, pretending to scroll through emails, answering one or two just to give the illusion of normalcy, while in truth, my mind was sifting through every move I'd made over the last few years, every lie I'd told with a straight face, every transaction that had passed through my hands, clean on the surface, but lined with shadows. I thought about the money, of course. I always thought about the money, how it bought silence, bought comfort, bought a kind of power I never imagined I'd possess, but now it felt heavier, less like a shield and more like an anchor. The luxury of pretending everything was under control had finally run its course. What most people don't understand about the kind of work I ended up doing is that it doesn't come with a handbook or an HR department, and it sure as hell doesn't come with an exit strategy. You don't just resign. You don't give 2 weeks' notice and walk away with a cake and a signed card. What I did, what I still do, lives in that space between the legal and the illicit, between plausible deniability and outright conspiracy, a role that doesn't exist on paper, but whose impact ripples out across people's lives whether they see it or not. I'm the middleman, the cleaner, the problem solver. I make things disappear, reroute information, shield people with more power than I'll ever have, and in return, I'm compensated in ways that most people wouldn't understand until they needed someone like me, and then, it's already too late. I'd been thinking about walking away. Not because I couldn't handle it anymore, but because something about Mom's face in the kitchen that morning, something about the way her eyes didn't flinch when she said, "Was it worth it?" had taken up residence in my mind, digging in like a splinter I couldn't ignore. Her question hadn't been about money or legality or even morality. It had been about identity. About the price of becoming someone she didn't recognize. And now, with the loose thread of that discovery dangling out in the open, I knew it was only a matter of time before the rest of the sweater unraveled. I made the decision that afternoon, while walking down the gravel path behind the house that led to the lake. I would shut it all down, cut off the last few accounts, ghost the encrypted lines, walk away from M and the others, take whatever was left and disappear into a version of myself that didn't need to be constantly watching her own back. I knew it wouldn't be easy, and it damn sure wouldn't be clean, but I'd survived harder exits. I figured I had one good vanishing act left in me. But life, as it often does, had other plans. When I returned to the house, Emily was sitting at the kitchen table, pale and quiet, her fingers wrapped around her coffee mug like it was the only thing tethering her to the floor. She didn't look at me when I walked in. Just said, without preamble, "Jacob knows." 2 words. Just like that. Enough to make my stomach knot and my pulse quicken. Because if Jacob knew, it meant someone had either talked or someone had looked too closely, and I knew damn well it wasn't Mom. She didn't have it in her to dig deeper, not anymore, and it wasn't Emily, because fear made her loyal. At least where this was concerned. which meant Jacob, in all his smug mediocrity, had finally sniffed out something real. I didn't ask how. I didn't need to. People like Jacob don't find truth through intelligence. They find it through arrogance, through chance, through a combination of ignorance and luck that makes them dangerous because they don't understand the value of what they've uncovered. They just want to hold it up and shake it in the air like a prize, screaming, "Look what I found," without thinking of the consequences. "He thinks you're laundering for someone big," Emily said, her voice low and flat. I told him it wasn't true, that he didn't know what he was talking about, but he's not letting it go. And, just like that, the plan shifted. Walking away quietly wasn't an option anymore. I had to act fast, smarter than him, quicker than the rumors that would follow if he opened his mouth at the wrong time in front of the wrong person. So I did what I always do, I took control. That night, after dinner, which was quiet and awkward, filled with the kind of shallow conversations people have when they're trying not to acknowledge a ticking time bomb, I waited until Jacob was outside, smoking near the fence, his phone glowing in his hand. I walked out, stood beside him for a moment, then said, without looking at him, "You ever wonder how Emily paid for that car?" His head turned just slightly, not enough to face me, just enough to show that I'd struck a nerve. I didn't wait for an answer. I kept going. Or how Mom's house got paid off early. Or where the money came from when your second DUI mysteriously disappeared from the record. I let it hang there, long enough for him to feel it, the weight of it, the implication of debts paid by hands he'd spent years mocking. Then I smiled, calm, controlled, the kind of smile that comes from knowing you've just taken back the high ground, and I said, "You're right to be curious, Jacob. Just remember, some truths come with a cost. And you're not the one who's been paying it." He didn't say a word. Didn't blink. Just stood there, still as a statue, the smoke from his cigarette curling into the air like a slow unraveling of bravado. By the time I went to bed, I knew he wouldn't talk. Not because he cared, but because cowards don't take risks when they realize they're not in control. He would stew in silence, unsure if I was bluffing or dangerous or both. Either way, I'd bought myself time. And maybe that's all I ever really had: time, bought and borrowed, stolen and stitched together by secrets, held in place by silence. The truth is, the real job was never about moving information or cleaning up messes or keeping powerful people out of trouble. The real job was surviving the space between who they think you are and who you really are. The real job was being the ghost in your own life, the architect of a reality no one else is allowed to see. And now that they'd caught a glimpse, now that the cracks had spread wide enough to show the machinery behind the curtain, I knew this story wasn't ending, it was just moving into a new phase. One where I no longer pretended. One where I finally lived without their approval. And one where they would have to decide whether the version of me they created was worth losing, because the real me, the one they never wanted to meet, had just walked into the room. And she wasn't leaving quietly.